a tiny red airplane bounced among the clouds 12,000 feet above the water of the North Atlantic. Giant black storm clouds lay between the plane and the shores of Ireland, and far below, icebergs jutted out of the cold waves. The year was 1932, and the plane carried Amelia Earhart, one of the most famous pilots in the United States. If she made it, she would be the first woman to fly an airplane over the Atlantic herself. But first, she had to succeed, and there was a reason why so few people had made it. The trip was perilous because airplanes in 1930 were small, most were not pressurized, and they didn't have many of the instruments that today's pilots rely on. A pilot had to go by her sense of sight and how the plane felt by keeping tight control of the airplane for hours at a time. The black clouds ahead were too large to fly around, so Earhart pointed her plane right into them. When the rain turned to ice, the plane's controls froze, sending it into a tailspin. As the plane plummeted toward the rigid water, Amelia struggled to get control. Finally, the warmer air below the clouds melted the ice, and Amelia was able to pull the plane out of its spin. Many hours later, Earhart landed the plane down in a pasture in Londonderry, Northern Ireland. She had finally done it. She had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in an airplane she flew herself. On this journey, she had to fight many other problems, including fatigue, a leaky fuel tank, and a cracked manifold that occasionally spewed flames. Earhart had already been famous as an aviator and an adventurer, and now she would become a legend. But she would be most remembered for what many people think of as her biggest failure. While trying to fly her plane around the world, she disappeared. Her mysterious disappearance, added to all of this, has given Earhart lasting recognition in popular culture as one of the world's most famous pilots. To this day, despite many theories though, no proof of Earhart's fate exists. Earhart's love for aviation was born when her father took her to an aerial show where she got to ride in an open cockpit flight over Los Angeles. Later, she said that by the time I had got 200 or 300 feet off the ground, I knew I had to fly. In 1922, just a few years after taking up flight, Earhart began attempting to break records. In 1928, a publicist in New York named George Putnam was searching for a woman to be the first to ride in an airplane over the Atlantic. It was a dangerous undertaking. 3 women had died trying to fly across the Atlantic the previous year. Once Putnam contacted Earhart, she agreed to be part of this flight. As a mere passenger on that flight, Earhart referred to herself as a sack of potatoes because she felt like she had no purpose. The first woman to cross the Atlantic made headlines around the world and received a ticket tape parade. Earhart did not think she deserved the attention she received, but was more determined to make the trip herself. 4 years later, in 1932, Amelia began her journey to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Despite eventually veering off course, she broke several records on the historic flight. Not only did she become the first woman to fly the Atlantic solo, and the only person to do it twice, she also broke the record for the longest flight by a woman, and broke the record for crossing the Atlantic Ocean in the shortest time. Earhart took off in the morning from Harbor Grace, Newfoundland, with that day's copy of the local newspaper to confirm the date of the flights. Almost immediately, the flight ran into difficulty as she encountered thick clouds and ice on the wings. After about 12 hours, the conditions got worse, and the plane began to experience mechanical difficulties. She knew she wasn't going to make it to Paris, so she started looking for a new place to land. She found a pasture just outside a small village in Londonderry, Northern Ireland, and successfully landed. This flight established Earhart as an international hero. In 1937, as Earhart neared her 40th birthday, she was ready for a monumental and final challenge. She wanted to be the first woman to fly around the world. While preparing for this flight, she said, "I have a feeling that there is just about one more good flight left in my system, and I hope this trip is it." Earhart pulled together a top-rated crew of 3 men, which included Captain Harry Manning, Fred Noonan, and Paul Mance. Manning, who had been the captain of the President Roosevelt, would become Earhart's first navigator. Noonan, who had vast experience in both marine and flight navigation, was to be the second navigator. Mance, a Hollywood stunt pilot, was chosen to be Earhart's technical advisor. For her around-the-world flight, the airplane that Amelia Earhart chose was a Lockheed Electra 10E, manufactured by the Lockheed Aircraft Company. The Electra Model 10 was an all-metal, twin-engine, low-wing monoplane with retractable landing gear, designed as a small, medium-range airliner. In the standard configuration, it carried a crew of 2 and up to 10 passengers. Earhart wanted special modifications in her plane, and these included 4 auxiliary fuel tanks in the passenger compartment, a navigator station to the rear of that, elimination of passenger windows, installation of various radio and navigation equipment, and additional batteries. The original plan was to take off from Oakland, California and fly west to Hawaii. From there, the group would fly across the Pacific Ocean to Australia. Then they would cross the subcontinent of India, onto Africa, then to Florida, and back to California. On March 17, 1937, they took off from Oakland on the first leg. They experienced some periodic problems flying across the Pacific and landed in Hawaii for some repairs. After 3 days, the Electra began its takeoff, but something went wrong. Earhart lost control and looped the plane on the runway. How this happened is still the subject of some controversy. Several witnesses, including an Associated Press journalist, said they saw a tire blow. Other sources, including Paul Manst, indicated it was a pilot error. Although no one was seriously hurt, the plane was severely damaged and had to be shipped back to California for extensive repairs. Meanwhile, Earhart and Putnam secured additional funding for a new flight. The stress of the delay and the grueling fundraising appearances left Earhart exhausted. By the time the plane was repaired, weather patterns and global wind changes required alterations to the flight plan. This time, Earhart and her crew would fly east. Captain Harry Manning would not join the team due to previous commitments. Paul Manst was also absent, reportedly due to a contract dispute. After flying from Oakland to Miami, Florida, Earhart and Noonan took off on June 1st from Miami with much fanfare and publicity. They first flew to Puerto Rico, and then eastward toward Africa. From here, they flew to the Red Sea, to Karachi, Pakistan, and to Calcutta, India. Later from India, they continued to Rangoon, Bangkok, and Singapore. At Port Darwin, Australia, they were able to make crucial repairs to their plane. Amelia reached Lae, New Guinea on June 29. By this time, about 22,000 miles of the journey had been completed. The remaining 7,000 miles would take place over the Pacific. In Lae, several necessary adjustments were made to the plane. Extra amounts of fuel were stowed on board. The parachutes were packed away, for there would be no need for them while flying along the vast and desolate Pacific Ocean. Her plan was to head to Howland Island, 2,556 miles away, situated between Hawaii and Australia. A flat sliver of land 6,500 feet long, 1,600 feet wide, and no more than 20 feet above the ocean waves, the island would be hard to distinguish from similar-looking cloud shapes. Howland is such a small spot in the Pacific that every aid to locating it must be available, Earhart emphasized. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter, Itasca, the radio contact, was stationed just offshore of Howland Island. 2 other U.S. ships, ordered to burn every light on board, were positioned along the flight route as markers. To meet this challenge, Earhart and Noonan had an elaborate plan with several contingencies. Celestial navigation would be used to track the routes and keep them on course. In the case of overcast skies, they had radio communication with a U.S. Coast Guard vessel, Itasca, stationed off Howland Island. After aligning themselves with Howland's correct latitude, they would run north and south looking for the island and the smoke plume to be sent up by the Itasca. They even had emergency plans to ditch the plane if need be, believing the empty fuel tanks would give the plane some buoyancy, as well as time to get into the small inflatable raft to wait for rescue. Earhart and Noonan set out from Lae on July 2, 1937 at 12:30 a.m., heading east toward Howland Island. Though the flyers seemed to have a well-thought-out plan, several early decisions led to grave consequences later on. Radio equipment with shorter wavelength frequencies were left behind, presumably to allow more room for fuel canisters. This equipment could broadcast radio signals farther distances. On top of this, due to inadequate quantities of high-octane fuel, the Electra carried about 1,000 gallons, 50 gallons short of full capacity. The crew ran into difficulty almost from the start. Witnesses to the July 2 takeoff reported that a radio antenna may have been damaged. It is also believed that, due to the extensive overcast conditions, Noonan might have had extreme difficulty with celestial navigation. If that weren't enough, it was later discovered that the flyers were using maps that may have been inaccurate. According to experts, evidence shows that the charts used by Noonan and Earhart placed Howland Island nearly 6 miles off its actual position. These circumstances led to a series of problems that couldn't be solved, As Earhart and Noonan reached the supposed position of Howland Island, they maneuvered into the north and south tracking route to find the island. They looked for visual and auditory signals from the Itasca, but for various reasons, radio communication was very poor that day. There was also confusion between Earhart and the Itasca over which frequencies to use, and a misunderstanding as to the agreed-upon check-in time. The flyers were operating on Greenwich Civil Time, and the Itasca was operating on the Naval Time Zone, which set their schedules 30 minutes apart. As dawn neared, Earhart called the Itasca, reporting cloudy weather, cloudy. In later transmissions, Earhart asked the Itasca to take bearings on her. The Itasca sent her a steady stream of transmissions, but she could not hear them. On the morning of July 2, 1937, at 7:20 a.m., Earhart reported her position, placing the Electra on a course at 20 miles southwest of Nuku-Manu Islands. At 7:42 a.m., the Itasca picked up this message from the Earhart. "We must be on you, but we cannot see you. Fuel is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet." The ship replied, but there was no indication that Earhart heard this. The flyer's last communication was at 8:43 a.m. Though the transmission was marked as questionable, it is believed Earhart and Noonan thought they were running along the north-south line. However, Noonan's chart of Howland's position was off by 5 nautical miles. When the Itasca realized that they had lost contact, they began an immediate search. Despite the efforts of 66 aircrafts and 9 ships, an estimated $4 million rescue authorized by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the fate of the 2 flyers remained a mystery. The official search ended on July 18, 1937, but Putnam financed additional search efforts, working off tips of naval experts and even psychics in an attempt to find his wife. In October 1937, he acknowledged that any chance of Earhart and Noonan surviving was gone. On January 5, 1939, Earhart was declared legally dead by the Superior Court of Los Angeles. Now let's take a look at some of the theories surrounding Earhart's disappearance. Amelia Earhart: The Lost Evidence was an investigative special on History Channel that aired in 2017, exploring the significance of a photograph discovered by a retired federal agent in the National Archives. The photograph was supposedly taken by a spy on Jalowit Island and has been found to be unaltered. In addition, a ship is seen towing an object that aligns with the measurements of Earhart's plane. The claim is if Earhart and Noonan landed there, the Japanese ship Koshimaru was in the area and could have taken them and the plane to Jalowit before bringing them as prisoners to Saipan. Earhart expert Richard Gillespie, who leads the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIGHAR, told The Guardian that the photo was silly. Also, this theory was debunked quickly, as in July 2017, a Japanese military blogger found the same photo in a Japanese-language travelogue archived in Japan's National Library, and the picture was published in 1935, 2 years before Earhart's disappearance. Since her disappearance, several theories have formed regarding Earhart's last days, many of which have been connected to various artifacts that have been found on Pacific islands. One theory is that the plane that Earhart and Noonan were flying was ditched or crashed, and the 2 perished at sea. Another theory, which is championed by TIGHAR, is that Earhart and Noonan might have flown without radio transmission for some time after the last radio signal, landing at uninhabited Nico Maroro Reef, a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean 350 miles southeast of Howland Island. This island is where they would ultimately die. In 2017, a team of 4 forensic bone-sniffing dogs with TIGHAR and the National Geographic Society claimed to have found the spot where Earhart may have died. In 1940, a British official reported finding human bones beneath a tree and sent samples of the soil to a lab in Germany for DNA analysis. In 2018, anthropologist Richard Jantz announced the results of a study in which he re-examined the original forensic analysis of the bones discovered in 1940. The original analysis determined the bones to possibly be from a short, stocky European male. After comparing the bone measurements to data from 2,776 other people from the time period, and studying photos of Earhart and her clothing measurements, Jantz concluded that there was a likely match. Complementing the results of the bone analysis, in 2018, TIGHAR released a report built around years of analysis of radio distress signals sent by Earhart in the days after her disappearance. They studied tide patterns and determined that the distress signals corresponded with the reef's low tides, the only time Earhart could run the plane's engine without fear of flooding. Furthermore, Various citizens documented the reception of messages from Earhart via radio. 2 days after the crash, a San Francisco resident heard a voice from the radio saying, "Still alive, better hurry, tell husband all right." 3 days later, someone in eastern Canada picked up the message. "Can you read me? Can you read me? This is Amelia Earhart, please come in." Based on the above evidence, Tigard put forward a hypothesis. Key points of their hypothesis are that, having failed to find Howland Island, Amelia and Noonan continued on the navigational line Amelia said they were following. That line led them to uninhabited Gardner Island, where Amelia landed the Electra safely on the island's reef. For the next several nights, they used the aircraft's radio to send distress signals. Radio bearings taken on the signals crossed in the vicinity of Gardner Island. 1 week after the flight disappeared, 3 U.S. Navy search planes flew over Gardner Island. By then, the distress calls had stopped. Rising tides and surf had swept the Electra over the reef's edge. Navy flyers saw no airplane, but they did see signs of recent habitation. They thought that all the islands in the area were inhabited, so they moved on. Earhart, and possibly Noonan, lived for a time as castaways on the waterless atoll. Relying on rain squalls for drinking water, they caught and cooked small fish, seabirds, turtles, and clams. Amelia died at a makeshift campsite on the island's southeast end. Noonan's fate is unknown. Whatever remains of the Electra lies in deep water off the island's west coast. So what really happened? Like other topics, I have spent countless hours going through the archives of Tigard and any other evidence that I could get my hands on. Researching this topic, I came across these headlines from respectable media houses and many similar types of videos from other YouTubers, as if this mystery has been resolved once and for all. This media frenzy happened after the journal Forensic Anthropology released a paper by Richard Jantz, professor at University of Tennessee's Forensic Anthropology Center. Jantz compared old data from about 13 human bones found in 1940 on the remote Pacific island of Nikumaroro with what's known about Earhart's physique. Although the bones in question have long since vanished, they were examined at the time by a Fiji-based forensic anthropologist named D.W. Hoodless, who concluded that their size indicated that they came from a male. Revisiting the info, Jantz scrutinized the remains relative to old photographs of Earhart and to clothing that once belonged to her. He decided that given Earhart's likely skeletal structure and height, about 5'7", they were consistent with a body type very similar to hers. The analysis reveals that Earhart is more similar to Nikumaroro bones than 99% of individuals in a large reference sample. Jantz wrote, "Sounds great! So is the mystery resolved now? I do not think so. There's no documented evidence that Earhart was anywhere near Nikumaroro." Jantz's argument depends on accepting the claim that Earhart and her navigator crashed on Nikumaroro's reef and survived there for a while as castaways. But this notion remains the unlikely and unproven theory of a single organization, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, Tigard. Though Jantz is not a member of Tigard, they helped facilitate the cooperation of a Purdue University archive that provided measurements from a pair of Earhart's trousers. Jantz himself calls this relationship with Tigard collaborative. But the main question is, what if this hypothesis is false? Jantz acknowledges that there's nothing about the bones in and of themselves that establishes them as being Earhart's. We are first concluding that Earhart lived as castaway on that island, and later simply comparing the lengths of these bones to her clothing and saying yes, there is possibility that these bones could belong to her. But as with other hypotheses, we need to take these findings with a grain of salt. The assertion that Earhart's bones have been found fits in with a long pattern of Tigard, claiming that some new artifact or lead was about to solve the mystery for good. This kind of thing has been going on since 1989, when Tigard's first expedition to Nikumaroro yielded a metal bookcase that, Gillespie was convinced, came from Earhart's plane. Ultimately, nothing came of this object, which Gillespie once referred to as the Grail. In another expedition that happened in 2012, which was based on newly discovered images that, according to Gillespie, showed a piece of the Electra's landing gear in the waters off Nikumaroro. "I'm quite sure it's there," he told the Washington Post. In 2014, after Tigard announced finding a photograph of Earhart's plane, a Lockheed Electra, showing an aluminum patch that could maybe resemble a piece of aluminum scrap recovered from the island on a prior expedition. He declared, "We reached a point where we feel very confident we have a part of the airplane." In the years since, Tighar has made 11 more trips to this island. During that time, they have found a woman's shoe, a bottle that may once have contained freckle cream, a wooden box that may have held a sextant, a piece of aluminum and other assorted items, and a baby skeleton in an island grave that they dug up. Over time, none of these leads have panned out. So why all these speculations? Because there aren't many established facts about Earhart's last hours. But if we look closely at the evidence backed up by science, there are some clues, and they are important. For example, although Earhart's radios were not working properly and she was unable to hear the Itasca, its radio operators could hear her. Among other communications, she reported a position at 200 miles out and then again at 100 miles out. Operators on the Itasca recorded signal strengths on a 1 to 5 scale, with 5 the strongest and clearest. During each report, her signals gained in strength. She was, it seems, heading to Howland as planned in clear sky conditions. During her approach, Earhart said, "I must be on you, but cannot see you." At which point, the radio operator recorded the strongest signal yet, a 5+, so strong that men ran out onto the deck expecting to see her plane. They didn't, and Earhart's next transmission, which came soon after, dropped to a 5 as she reported that she was nearly out of fuel and flying north to south along compass bearing 157 to 337, which bisected Howland Island. And then nothing. Silence. Earhart and Noonan had vanished. So that means that at one time, they were really in the vicinity of Itasca, and later, while looking for Howland Island, moved away and eventually crashed somewhere where the plane ran out of fuel. Tighar believes that the pair flew farther south along that line until reaching Niku Maroro, where they successfully landed on the island's exposed reef. Niku Maroro lies 350 nautical miles south of Howland, and Earhart herself reported that she was running out of fuel near the island. Navy search planes flew over Niku Maroro a week after her disappearance and saw nothing related to the aviator. Not a human, not an airplane or the debris of one, not a smoke signal, not any SOS written with palm fronds. But could she reach Niku Maroro? In 1999, a detailed analysis of the fuel consumption of Earhart's plane, done by Fred Kulick, a professor of mechanical engineering and jet propulsion at Caltech, determined that Earhart was, as she stated, nearly out of fuel right at the time when she said she was, putting Niku Maroro far out of reach. His thesis was that the fuel duration of 24 hours commonly attributed to the Electra was incorrect for several reasons, and that the real figure was probably between 20 and 21 hours. The high daytime temperature at tropical Ley would have made the fuel less dense. Furthermore, the calculated range of the airplane did not take into account the effective altitude on specific fuel consumption. In principle, this should not have mattered. The Electra would have still had sufficient fuel for the 2,600-mile trip and then some. But nature failed to cooperate. Earhart had to cope up with 26-mile-per-hour headwind that effectively decreased the range of her Electra. This meant that when the Itasca last heard from Earhart, 20 hours and 13 minutes after takeoff, her fuel was, as she herself reported, running low, and the Electra could not have reached any land other than Howland or the nearby and even smaller Baker Island. On the basis of the best available information about the airplane and its engines, and of Earhart's radioed reports during the course of the flight, it was concluded that she would have run out of fuel after 20 hours and 38 minutes in the air. Earhart reported over Itasca 19 hours, 12 minutes after takeoff. There were difficulties with the radios. Voice communications were hard to understand. Earhart did not know Morse code. She was unable to get a bearing on the cutter, and the cutter could not get a bearing on her. At 1,000 feet, visual range would have been limited by the horizon, and the island, no part of which rises more than 20 feet above sea level, would have been hard to spot from more than a few miles off. So, you will ask, what about those radio transmissions supposedly picked up by random people thousands of miles away? Well, none have been verified as coming from Earhart. And what about the various pieces of junk and bones found there over time? Well, fishermen and voyagers had been stopping at Niku Maroro for centuries. Waves and winds sent flotsam and jetsam across vast stretches of ocean. For these and other reasons, Tygar's theory seems far-fetched to me. As I see it, everything they claim as evidence isn't evidence at all. You take one item that cannot be connected to Amelia Earhart in any way, and then take 10 more items that in themselves cannot be connected to her and say, hey, we have all this evidence, and many people then say it could be true. But the consensus about the wrong answer is still wrong. Tygar's whole theory persists because it's easy and cheap for a group of amateurs to look on an island instead of under 18,000 feet of ocean, which requires massive amounts of money, know-how, and technology. After all, an island is a much easier place to search than under 18,000 feet of ocean. So, what comes next? Tygar says that they have no immediate plans to go back to the island. Having combed the place so many times, the only thing left now is to search the deep ocean off Nikumaroro, which is daunting. But when Tygar keeps on coming up with headlines like, Amelia Earhart has been found, it almost sounds like they're giving up and have no intentions of actually finding Earhart. So, what's my take on this mystery? I would say that the combination of headwinds, the fuel capacity of the plane, the limited navigational precision, and the tiny size of the target made Earhart's flight risky. Radio, in effect, should have made the tiny island much larger. But when the radio direction finders did not work, everything came down to luck. Luck had served the intrepid Earhart pretty well in the past, but it's not a substitute for fuel or finding the destination. And on that fateful day, like her fuel, it ran out. And now she rests under 18,000 feet of ocean, with a radius of roughly 100 to 300 nautical miles of Howland Island. I hope you enjoyed this video. Just one thing more. I will be uploading videos regularly, so don't forget to subscribe. Stay healthy, stay safe. See you next time.